When 850 caliber Browning machine guns ignite at 2,400 rounds per minute, the sky stops being a battlefield and becomes a slaughterhouse. It's the Pacific, 1944. Japan believes its Ki-43 Oscar fighters rule the air, lightweight, agile, able to twist out of danger and dance around anything the Americans put up. Their pilots think speed and maneuverability will save them. They have no idea what's coming. Then, out of the sun, a new American monster appears. Not sleek, not elegant, just enormous, armored, and angry. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, a 10-ton flying battering ram with a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine spitting out 2,530 horsepower, thicker armor than some tanks, and enough firepower to shred a Zero into confetti before the pilot even knows he's under attack. Japanese Ki-43s try to climb, they try to dive, they try to evade. But every attempt looks like they're shifting into reverse as those 50 cal bursts rip through wings, engines, and cockpits with horrifying ease. The Pacific would never be the same. Before we dive headfirst into the brutal engineering that turned the P-47 Thunderbolt into a flying buzzsaw, I need something from you. And don't skip this part. Where are you watching this from right now? Are you in California, sipping coffee while imagining those 50 cals lighting up the Pacific? Maybe you're in Texas, where horsepower is practically a birthright. Could be New York, Florida, Ohio, or some quiet town I've never heard of, but that will forever be connected to this moment in history. Type your city and state down in the comments, because I want to know exactly where these stories of American air power are landing. And while you're already scrolling, smash that like button if you felt the shockwave of those Thunderbolt guns in your imagination. It tells YouTube this isn't just another history video. It's a mission brief. And if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? There are stories coming that make this one look tame. Buckle in. The real carnage is just starting. The first thing you need to understand about the P-47 Thunderbolt is that it shouldn't have existed. Not logically, not aerodynamically, not according to any doctrine of air combat at the time. Fighter aircraft in World War II were supposed to be sleek, nimble, and feather-light. Machines that could pirouette through the clouds, chase an opponent's tail, and outdance death. The Thunderbolt laughed at that philosophy. It wasn't a dancer, it was a prize fighter with concrete fists. It didn't chase you, it hunted you, and when it found you, it didn't simply shoot you down, it erased you. Standing nose to tail at over 36 feet in length, with a wingspan of 40 feet 9 inches, and tipping the scales at nearly 14,000 pounds fully loaded, the P-47 was the heaviest single-engine fighter ever deployed in significant numbers. It weighed more than some twin-engine aircraft. Japanese pilots climbing into their Ki-43 Oscars, airframes barely armored, clocking in around 5,000 pounds, thought they were entering an aerial ballet. Then they looked up and saw a steel anvil sprinting at them like a meteor. Inside that monstrous fuselage lived the beating heart of American industrial dominance, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp, an 18-cylinder, air-cooled radial beast capable of producing more than 2,500 horsepower. Just to start, it required procedures that looked less like aircraft preparation and more like waking a dragon. When it roared to life, the ground shook. Maintenance crews learned quickly. If you're standing too close, you don't hear the engine, you feel it. And that engine wasn't pushing some delicate airframe of aluminum lace. The fuselage was thick, rugged, engineered to take hits and keep flying. Enemy fighters could pour bullets into a Thunderbolt and watch them bounce. Japanese Ki-43 pilots discovered, to their horror, that their 12.7mm guns, effective against Zeros, Wildcats, and even light bombers, might as well be flicking pebbles at a battleship. The Thunderbolt's armor plate behind the pilot's seat alone weighed more than an entire Ki-43 cockpit structure. You could set a P-47 on fire, rip pieces off the wings, smash coolant lines, damage control surfaces, and it would still claw for altitude and come back for revenge. But nothing defined the Thunderbolt like its guns. 8 Browning AN-M2, 50 caliber machine guns, 4 per wing, spitting a combined 100 rounds per second. Each bullet weighed nearly an ounce and traveled at over 2,800 feet per second. Multiply that by 8 streams, each a chainsaw of burning lead, and you get the closest thing World War II ever saw to an airborne industrial shredder. 1-second bursts were enough to turn an aircraft into flying debris. 3 seconds, you didn't have an airplane anymore. You had smoke and gravity. Japanese pilots trained their entire careers, believing speed and maneuverability were the ultimate equalizers. If you couldn't outgun an enemy, you outflew him. The Ki-43 Oscar, known for its graceful turns and minimal weight, was the purest expression of that doctrine, but the Thunderbolt exposed the flaw immediately. Maneuverability is irrelevant when the first hit kills you. You don't dodge 8 converging 50 cal streams. You don't outrun a dive exceeding 500 miles per hour. You don't climb away from a plane that dives faster than gravity wants it to fall. The P-47 could pick its fight, dictate its angle, and leave at will. And here's the part that shattered Japanese confidence. They were used to seeing American aircraft pull up or break away once fuel, ammo, or altitude became a concern. The Thunderbolt didn't break away. It lingered. It waited. It hunted in packs, and once it owned the sky, it descended on anything that moved. Fighters, transports, barges, even infantry columns. Ki-43 pilots who tried to escape often had the same final thought. Why does it look like we're flying backwards? Because against a machine with this much momentum, mass, and murderous intent, they were. The Pacific War's air dynamic had just flipped upside down, and Japan was about to learn exactly what happens when American engineering stops trying to match an enemy and starts trying to bury him. While Japanese engineers obsessed over maneuverability and finesse, American designers embraced a different doctrine entirely: overmatch. The Thunderbolt wasn't built to dodge danger, it was built to erase it. And nowhere did this philosophy become more terrifyingly clear than in its dive performance. Most fighters lost stability or risked catastrophic airframe failure past 450 miles per hour. The P-47 treated that number like a warm-up jog. Pilots routinely pushed past 500 mph in combat dives, with some records noting near 600 mass at mph, a speed range where control surfaces stiffen, oxygen becomes scarce, and the line between pilot and projectile disappears. Imagine you're a Ki-43 pilot. Your Oscar, light as a feather turning on a dime, feels invincible in a dogfight until a Thunderbolt appears overhead. You bank hard. You dive. You do everything your instructors drilled into you. And yet, this metallic avalanche keeps descending, not losing speed, not losing control, simply falling like judgment itself. At those velocities, the Thunderbolt didn't need to outturn you. It didn't need to chase. It simply had to be behind you for 2 seconds. That was enough. Burst fire. Contact. The fight ends. And that was only the gun package. The P-47's secondary armament turned dangerous aircraft into flying apocalypse. Fully loaded, the Thunderbolt could carry up to 2,500 pounds of ordnance, including 500-pound, 1,000-pound, and 2,000-pound bombs, as well as M8 4.5-inch rockets capable of piercing armored decks and ripping destroyers open like sardine cans. The Ki-43, by comparison, carried a single bomb barely heavier than an American pilot's breakfast. Japanese aviators flew weapons delivery profiles that resembled farming equipment spreading fertilizer. The P-47 parachuted industrial death. Its bomb rack configurations meant it could destroy runways, fuel depots, artillery positions, convoys, and troop concentrations in a single sortie. Japanese infantry quickly learned a cruel lesson. If you heard a Thunderbolt's engine overhead, cover was optional. Survival was not guaranteed. Even palm trees and jungle canopy, natural defenses that once shielded soldiers, became useless when 50-cal incendiaries sliced through leaves, limbs and bodies with equal indifference. There's a reason ground crews called the P-47 the flying sledgehammer, and Japanese pilots whispered about it like a sky-bound Oni, a demon that traded grace for unstoppable power. And the terror wasn't only technological, it was psychological. The Ki-43 Oscar had been a symbol of Japanese aerial pride, the delicate rapier of the Imperial Army Air Service. Suddenly, pilots who trained their entire lives to outsmart opponents found themselves trapped inside a coffin, wrapped in canvas and optimism. Their greatest maneuvering tricks, high-angle loops, rolling climbs, snap turns, meant nothing when a thunderbolt showed up. American pilots soon discovered something chilling. If they fired too soon, Japanese fighters simply evaporated. No dramatic spiral, no cinematic explosion, just aircraft disintegrating mid-air, wings departing the fuselage, vapor trails dissolving into the sky like the ghost of a machine that realized it was already dead. The Thunderbolt turned engagements into executions. Pilots joked that their biggest problem wasn't missing shots, it was holding fire long enough to avoid overkill. And then came the moment Japan realized they were facing more than a plane. They were facing an industrial ecosystem. The Thunderbolt rolled out of factories like a steel crop, over 15,000 units built, each one a physical manifestation of American foundries, machine tooling, petroleum refinement, and logistical efficiency. Japan, constrained by limited resources and overextended commitments, simply could not compete. The Ki-43 was a duelist. The P-47 was a factory's answer to war. Pilots who once entered the cockpit with swagger now hesitated, hands trembling before ignition. They knew the truth. A single Thunderbolt could erase their squadron. And when the first packs of P-47s arrived over Pacific airfields, Japanese flight instructors stopped teaching combat tactics and started teaching survival tactics, an admission that the skies they once owned no longer belonged to them. The balance of power was shifting. The Thunderbolt wasn't just winning dogfights, it was dismantling an ideology. The moment American pilots realized what the Thunderbolt could do, the Pacific Air War transformed from a contest to a purge. At first, they flew the P-47 like any other fighter, turning, climbing, engaging cautiously. But once they understood its true nature, the rules changed. The aircraft wasn't meant to dance, it was meant to pounce. And once pilots adapted to that mindset, Japanese squadrons started disappearing faster than command could replace them. The first shock for the Japanese didn't come from the Thunderbolt's guns or bombs. It came from something far more demoralizing: the climb rate. The P-47 could ascend more than 3,000 feet per minute under combat conditions. That meant it could determine altitude dominance, the most valuable currency in aerial warfare. Whoever holds the high ground decides when a fight begins, who survives it, and who becomes wreckage on the jungle floor. The Ki-43 was nimble, sure, but you can't dogfight someone who starts above you, dives like a stone, and shreds you before you even complete your turn. Pilots began reporting that Thunderbolts didn't arrive into battle. They fell into battle. From altitudes the Ki-43 couldn't reach without risking engine failure. Japanese formations became haunted by a terrifying sound, that deep radial rumble from above, building into a roar, followed by impossible closing speed, and then silence. Silence meant someone had just been hit. Silence meant another Oscar was gone. What made the situation even worse was the Thunderbolt's durability. This wasn't just an aircraft that killed well, it refused to die. Pilots returned home with tails missing, wings punctured, oil leaks, bullet holes big enough to put your fist through, and still landed like nothing happened. Some limped back after being hit by anti-aircraft fire that would have turned lighter fighters into falling confetti. The P-47 didn't flinch. American engineers didn't build it to avoid damage. They built it to outlive it. And then, something unexpected happened. Something that no doctrine, no training manual, no imperial strategist had ever prepared Japan for. The Thunderbolt started hunting in wolf packs. One aircraft diving on you was terrifying. 4 descending at 500 Mach was psychological obliteration. Japanese pilots began calling the attacks Totsugeki Tatsumaki, assault tornadoes. Whole squadrons vanished in minutes. Some reports stating that P-47s ended battles without ever entering a traditional turning engagement. Why turn when you can strike once, kill instantly, and exit the fight before your enemy reacts? Ground crews in the Pacific eventually adopted a grim routine. When Thunderbolt units returned from sorties, mechanics didn't ask, "Did you get one?" They asked, "How many?" On some missions, the answer was, "We stopped counting." Japanese intelligence units scrambled for explanations. Was it the guns, the armor, the engine? None of those answers satisfied commanders. Anyone could build a gun. Anyone could weld armor. The P-47 was different because America could build thousands. Japan wasn't fighting a machine. It was fighting a manufacturing miracle. Historians often claim Japan lost the Pacific because of fuel, carriers, or radar deficiencies. But pilots who were there, men who watched their friends vanish in gunpowder and smoke, tell a different story. They say the war shifted when the Thunderbolt arrived, not because it entered the fight, but because it ended it. By the summer of 1944, Japanese pilots stopped calling the P-47 an airplane. They called it a verdict. If you saw it above you, the case was closed. If it fired, the sentence was death. And if it disappeared into the clouds, it wasn't retreating. It was circling back. Because the Thunderbolt wasn't content to win dogfights. It came to end them. The Japanese High Command tried to rationalize the chaos. They blamed poor tactics, inexperienced pilots, inferior fuel, even weather conditions. Anything, except the truth staring them in the face. The Ki-43 Oscar was a relic, and the P-47 Thunderbolt was the future. One was built for a world where dogfighting meant swirling turns and acrobatics. The other was born into a world where physics itself became a weapon. Thunderbolt pilots didn't need to chase kills. They engineered inevitability. Their standard engagement profile became known as boom and zoom, a tactic so brutally efficient it rewrote the Pacific sky. Climb to impossible altitude, dive at terminal velocity, fire a burst that ripped sheet metal, armor, and bone apart. Then, before any Japanese pilot could blink, open the throttle, climb again, and reset the trap. No turn fights, no prolonged engagements, no second chances. Japanese pilots would look up, see thunderbolts above them, and feel a sensation they had never experienced in aerial combat. Helplessness. The Oscar could outturn nearly anything in the world, except bullets moving faster than 2,800 feet per second. Against that kind of velocity, evasion wasn't strategy, it was denial. That helplessness soon infected entire airfields. Mechanics, who once prepared Ki-43s with enthusiasm, now worked in grim silence, aware that many of the aircraft they serviced would never return. Newly minted pilots, barely trained, barely ready, would start their engines with hands shaking on the throttle. They weren't entering combat, they were stepping into an execution chamber disguised as a cockpit. One Japanese veteran later admitted, "We no longer fought the Americans, we fought the Thunderbolt, and we lost before we climbed into the air." The numbers confirmed the nightmare. American kill ratios spiraled upward to unprecedented levels. Some Thunderbolt squadrons reached 10-to-1 air-to-air victories, ratios so absurd that Japanese analysts assumed reporting errors. That disbelief vanished once they examined the gun camera footage. Oscars dissolving in flame, wings severed mid-flight, engines separating from fuselages, and pilots bailing out with parachutes that never opened in time. And remember, this was just the Thunderbolt as a fighter. Things became apocalyptic when it was deployed as a ground attack platform. In New Guinea, the Philippines, and later Okinawa, the P-47 didn't merely destroy targets. It erased them from geography. Japanese convoys that once depended on jungle camouflage and mobility suddenly found themselves exposed. Roads turned into graveyards, bridges detonated into splinters, fuel depots erupted into mushroom clouds that could be seen miles away. Every sortie felt like a small apocalypse. The Thunderbolt wasn't a scalpel, it was a sledgehammer guided by radar, discipline, and American logistics. Japanese soldiers began referring to it as Raijin no Tetsu, the Iron Thunder God. Not poetic exaggeration, a statement of resignation. Reports circulated of entire infantry companies flattening themselves against the ground, not because they saw the Thunderbolt, but because they heard it. That signature radial growl became a death knell. Men would freeze, breathless, waiting for the ripping thunder of 50-cal bursts that tore vegetation, equipment, and flesh indiscriminately. By 1945, something unthinkable happened. Japanese pilots refused to engage Thunderbolts unless they had overwhelming numerical advantage. When they didn't, and they usually didn't, they simply turned away. That wasn't strategy. That was survival instinct overriding nationalism. The Oscar was still nimble. It was still graceful. But grace doesn't matter when death falls from above at 500 miles per hour. The P-47 didn't just dominate the air. It conquered the psychology of the sky. A fighter plane isn't supposed to end wars, yet somehow this one did. By the time the Thunderbolt was fully unleashed across the Pacific, Japanese strategists finally grasped what had gone wrong, not tactically, but philosophically. They had built an air force around honor, skill, and dueling. America had built a machine around physics, firepower, and survival. One was a warrior's code, the other was an industrial doctrine, and doctrines don't panic. They produce. Factories in Farmingdale, Evansville, and Indianapolis didn't care about martial poetry. They cared about output. They turned raw ore and petroleum into a weapon that could dive, climb, shoot, and return home riddled with scars, and do it again tomorrow. Japan built fighters like swordsmen, crafted katanas, elegant, deadly, but fragile. America forged Thunderbolts the way steel mills built locomotives, ugly, unstoppable, and terrifying. There's a reason the Thunderbolt's nickname wasn't something sleek or romantic. It was called the Jug, short for Juggernaut, because pilots knew exactly what it was. Not a bird of prey, but a battering ram with wings. It didn't stalk gracefully. It didn't threaten. It arrived. And arrival was everything. When Jug squadrons appeared over contested territory, Japanese operations changed instantly. Supply convoys halted. Command posts went silent. Anti-aircraft crews froze, asking the same question every time they saw that hulking silhouette. Do we shoot or do we pray? Neither option helped. Those 8 Browning 50 cals weren't just guns, they were a doctrine. In a 3-second burst, a Thunderbolt could send 300 rounds downrange. Multiply that by a full squadron, and you're talking literal walls of lead carving airspace into kill zones. Japanese pilots never flew through Thunderbolt formations. They flew into them once. The Ki-43 had 2 major weaknesses: almost no armor, and fuel tanks that turned into fireballs if you looked at them wrong. Thunderbolt pilots learned quickly. Don't bother lining up complex shots. Just tap the trigger. The Oscar would do the rest by obligingly exploding. But the real horror for Japan wasn't the Jug's performance in the air. It was its refusal to stay confined to the air. American commanders realized they had something unprecedented. A fighter that could replace bombers on missions dangerous enough to shred B-25s and devastate P-40s. The P-47 could escort, intercept, strafe, and bomb, all on the same sortie. During the Philippines campaign, Thunderbolts obliterated rail yards, sank barges, crushed artillery emplacements, and leveled ammunition depots. Their ability to carry 10 rockets or a combination of 500 and 1,000-pound bombs meant they didn't just damage infrastructure, they vaporized it. Japanese engineers spent days repairing what the Jug destroyed in minutes, only to watch another squadron roar overhead and erase their progress. One Army officer described it perfectly. Against the Thunderbolt, we could not plan. We could only react, and reaction is defeat. With each passing month, Thunderbolt tactics sharpened into ritual. Climb, strike, climb, strike again. Japanese resistance became ceremonial rather than strategic, and yet, for all its brutality, the P-47 inspired an unexpected respect from surviving enemy pilots. They didn't hate it. They feared it the way one fears nature. Typhoons, earthquakes, unstoppable forces that don't negotiate and don't apologize. By 1945, the desperate gamble arrived. Kamikaze doctrine. Pilots whose aircraft couldn't survive dogfights were now ordered to give their lives instead. The Thunderbolt's existence didn't just break the Japanese air service, it broke its worldview. When honor replaces strategy, defeat is inevitable. The Jug never asked for that role. It simply executed it. And Japan was running out of sky to hide in. At this point, the Japanese command finally understood a chilling truth. They weren't just losing pilots, planes, and aircraft carriers. They were losing time. Every day, the Thunderbolt remained in the sky. Japan's operational calendar shrank. Timelines evaporated. Deadlines became fantasies. You cannot wage war when your airfields are ablaze, your truck convoys are shredded, your artillery positions are smoking craters, and your fighters evaporate the moment they leave the runway. The P-47 wasn't a weapon. It was a countdown. American intelligence reports began documenting something unprecedented. Japanese pilots were now taking off with one goal, not to win, but simply to delay the inevitable. Many flights didn't even attempt interception. They climbed, saw the Thunderbolts above them, and fled. Others engaged out of obligation, only to die within seconds. This wasn't combat. This was ritualistic sacrifice to a machine that no longer acknowledged their presence. And remember, Japan's entire air doctrine was built around the Ki-43 Oscar. It was their primary army fighter, their workhorse, the backbone of their aerial identity. But the Oscar's design philosophy was born in the late 1930s, when Japan still believed wars were decided by individual skill. The Thunderbolt introduced a new era, one where wars were decided by horsepower, metallurgy, torque, and mass production. If you put both aircraft side by side, the mismatch becomes comically tragic. The Ki-43 featured wooden components, fabric-covered surfaces, and armor so thin some American test pilots joked it could be punctured with pocket knives. Meanwhile, the Thunderbolt carried armor plating up to half-an-inch thick self-sealing fuel tanks and a rugged airframe capable of taking hits that would instantly obliterate lighter fighters. American pilots didn't just survive hits. They collected them like decorations. One Thunderbolt returned home with over 200 bullet holes in its fuselage. Another limped back on one functioning control surface. Yet another survived a mid-air collision, lost a third of its wing, and still crash-landed intact. If the Ki-43 was a duelist, the P-47 was a barroom brawler who got stabbed twice, thrown through a window, set on fire, and still walked home, asking what time the next fight started. Japanese propaganda struggled to spin the disaster. They couldn't hide the truth. Soldiers heard it. Pilots lived it. Civilians whispered it. Reports spoke of airfields where Thunderbolts strafed so relentlessly that ground crews began digging trenches beside parked aircraft, hoping lightning wouldn't strike twice. But lightning did strike twice, and 3 times, and every morning. American pilots understood something deeper than tactics. Fear is a weapon. When fear precedes an aircraft by sound alone, when the rumble of a radial engine becomes synonymous with annihilation, the war has already been decided. One Japanese pilot wrote, after surviving a Thunderbolt attack, "We did not fight the enemy, we survived him." That sentence describes the transformation perfectly. Once the Americans fielded the P-47 in numbers, Japanese aviation shifted from offense to avoidance, from strategy to superstition. Pilots prayed more than they planned. Mechanics patched holes that would reappear before they dried. Commanders issued orders that assumed aircraft would die before they executed them. By late 1944, Japan was running out of experienced pilots, fuel reserves, operational aircraft, and illusions. The Thunderbolt didn't drain Japanese strength. It vacuumed it. It didn't conquer territory. It erased options. And soon Japan's greatest nightmare would arrive, not in the form of a bomber, but in the form of a replacement. Because as terrifying as the P-47 was, America wasn't done yet. Japan knew defeat was approaching long before the surrender documents were signed. Not because their fleets were destroyed, not because their cities burned, but because something far more lethal was happening in the sky. Their pilots no longer believed. Morale collapses quietly at first, like a hairline fracture on steel, and then suddenly it becomes a structural failure. The Thunderbolt was that fracture. Every mission it flew widened the crack. By 1945, something astonishing unfolded across the Pacific theater. Japanese airfields weren't defending their airspace, they were abandoning it. Pilots refused to scramble unless ordered at gunpoint. Ground crews stopped painting aircraft markings because the planes weren't expected to survive long enough for identification to matter. Intelligence reports revealed units requesting wooden decoys instead of replacement aircraft, because the real ones were guaranteed to be destroyed the moment Thunderbolts appeared. And why wouldn't they? The psychological carnage was relentless. A squadron of P-47s didn't look like fighters. It looked like a moving funeral procession. American pilots joked that the easiest part of their missions was taking off. The hard part was returning with enough ammunition left to justify landing. Now, here's where the story becomes unbelievable. As unstoppable as the P-47 Thunderbolt was, America was already preparing something even deadlier, the P-51 Mustang. Where the Jug was a battering ram, the Mustang was a guillotine. It was sleeker, faster, longer ranged, and optimized to escort bombers deep into hostile territory. Many assume the Mustang replaced the Thunderbolt because it was better. That's only half the story. The real reason was strategic alignment. The Jug was perfect for ground attack and medium-range devastation. The Mustang was perfect for large-scale cross-ocean campaigns. The Thunderbolt didn't lose relevance. It passed the torch. And what a torch it was. Even after the Mustang arrived, the Jug continued operating with one objective: obliteration. In Okinawa, P-47s turned Japanese positions into dust storms. In the Philippines, they shredded airstrips faster than engineers could rebuild them. In Burma, they hunted convoys like wolves running down prey. No battlefield was safe, no supply line was secure, no doctrine held. It wasn't just the aircraft that terrified Japan. It was what the aircraft represented, an industrial titan with the ability to mass-produce nightmares. Japan produced roughly 5,900 Ki-43 Oscars across the entire war. America produced more than 15,000 P-47 Thunderbolts, over 2.5 times as many, all heavier, stronger, and more technologically advanced. Imagine being a Japanese pilot strapped into an aircraft that weighed half as much, carried half the firepower, had half the survivability, and faced an enemy that could replace every loss before lunch. That's not war. That's predation. And Thunderbolt pilots embraced that role. They didn't duel. They dispatched. They didn't maneuver endlessly. They struck, confirmed, and climbed for another execution. They didn't worry about being outnumbered. They worried about running out of targets. One American pilot summarized it best. The Oscar wasn't an opponent, it was an opportunity. With every destroyed squadron, every shattered convoy, every airfield left smoking, the Jug drove a philosophical spear straight through Imperial Japanese air power. The message was undeniable. Skill matters. Courage matters. But neither can compensate for a nation that turns factories into weapons. In the end, the Japanese didn't lose because they lacked bravery. Their pilots were among the most fearless aviators ever to take flight. They lost because the Thunderbolt made courage irrelevant. A warrior can outfight a coward. But no warrior can outfight physics, horsepower, and mass production. The Jug didn't just dominate the battlefield, it reshaped aviation doctrine forever. Wars are remembered for generals, treaties, and turning points. But this war, this sky-bound reckoning over the Pacific, was shaped by machines that carried the will of a nation inside metal, fuel, and fire. The P-47 Thunderbolt didn't win because it was elegant. It won because it was undeniable. Its 50-caliber bursts, its unstoppable dives, its armor that shrugged off punishment, these weren't just features. They were declarations. Every rivet, every exhaust flame, every mission flown was a reminder of what happens when a country decides it will not be defeated. The men who strapped into those cockpits were not just pilots, they were engineers of fate, executing precision with courage most humans can barely comprehend. They didn't ask for guarantees, they asked for altitude, ammunition, and clearance for takeoff. And let's not forget the heroes who built, maintained, fueled, and armed these giants. Factories, mechanics, deck crews, designers, and logisticians, every one of them a silent warrior. Without them, the sky would have belonged to someone else. The Thunderbolt didn't merely shift air superiority, it took it. And in doing so, it honored every soldier, sailor, aviator, ship, wrench, tool, bullet, and bomb that carried the American flag into history. The Jug may be silent now, but its echo is permanent.